I have the same impression.
Yeah. Welcome on this kind of nasty fall day. It's a pleasure to have Ken Portney with us here today. Ken's director, second year, right? In the directorship for Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy at the Bush School of Government at A&M. So it's a research institute, similar to the extent that we're a research institute, separable from the academic side of things. He was at Tufts for 30 plus years, so I'm sure College Station is a lot like Tufts, right? But welcome.
Thank you.
To have you here. He thought, well, he had about a half an hour to talk. I said, no, you've got 5 minutes. We're keeping track. People will have read this, so you've got your 5.
I'm very pleased to hear that. I want to thank you for the invitation. It's a real great opportunity. I was especially pleased that the invitation suggested, as you know, that we should present or talk about something that's in the works, not something that's finished, and obviously that characterizes what I wrote. It's a field, an endeavor, an initiative that is early in its life for sure. And so part of what I want to get out of it is to pick your brains about your thoughts on these Nexus kinds of issues. Let me just start out by saying I do have some PowerPoint slides, but more than could possibly be covered in 5 minutes. But for those of you who aren't terribly interested, familiar with this Nexus idea, it really comes out of engineering and natural sciences, where people are running around trying to understand the connection between water and energy, water and food, food and energy. And typically we have this little diagram that tries to encapsulate the linkages. We know that when we extract energy resources, we use a lot of water. And nobody's more familiar with that than we are in Texas, where fracking has become a big deal. Texas, Oklahoma, and other states. These engineers tell us that an average fracking site uses somewhere around 2 to 3 million gallons of water over its lifetime. And when I say use, they use the water. When they're done with it, it's good for nothing else. They put nasty stuff in it, and then they deep well inject it, and it's out of sight and out of mind, perhaps, but it's water can't be used for anything else. That's the connection between energy. That's one connection between energy and water. We use a lot of water when we generate electricity. Most of our electric generating facilities use steam power, so they burn fossil fuels to generate heat, to boil water, to turn steam turbines. That uses the water. Some of it's recoverable and so on, but there is that connection. Of course, we need water for food. We need water to grow food. We need water to process the food that we eat. And there's a connection between energy and food. In any case, the engineering and science world has been taken by storm by these issues of Nexus, where people are running around creating systems models to depict the connections between and among these things. And even economists have jumped into the systems modeling, taking their systems and integrating them with some of the natural system models that the engineers use. But as I've interacted with people working on this in this area, it became pretty clear to me that they were highlighting interesting, important things, but that their ideas about what was going to come out of their research were naive at best. That they thought if they just get the models right, then policymakers will know how to fix the problems that are there. They'll know how to generate electricity with less water and so on. And as a policy person, I said, you got to be nuts. We know that doesn't happen automatically, if it happens at all. And so it started discussions we've had about whether there are governance nexus issues involved. And so I started working on a variety of different governance nexus related issues, or nexus governance issues. And I realized that, those of us who work in this field don't have that much to say. I mean, we can point to various kinds of theories that we work with, theories of policymaking or other social and policy and management theories, but when push comes to shove, we don't have a whole lot to say about how the nexus should look, what it should look like if we want our policymakers or our policy implementers to make different decisions. And so that's what started me on this road. And my hope is that I can get some really juicy ideas from you guys about things that I'm overlooking or not understanding, and maybe I can do the same. So let me see, I'll just say a couple more words. So we'll talk about this. So the thing that drives me is on what basis or under what theory would we expect changes to existing governance of water, energy, and food to produce changes in resource outcomes of the sort seemingly advocated by WEF Nexus research. This is a core research question that I think we all ought to be interested in at some level and in some context. So the work that I've done has looked at the idea of promoting, call it what you want, coordinated, collaborative, cooperative governance between people who work in water, people who work in energy, people who work in ag, eat food. And that's what governs, that's what pushes me to do the kind of, or at least start to try to do the kind of network analysis that's described in the paper, building on the works of Mark Lubell and many others whose work really is centrally focused on these issues of coordination, collaboration. The issue is whether this approach can help us understand how to promote better coordination or collaboration among these policy issues. So that's, I'm going to stop right there and have a chat, have a talk. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's perfect. Perfect. I'll take the cue. Nico, we're getting lots of folks here.
So I was wondering if from a normative perspective, we could think of the issue of collaboration. So in the paper, you lay out the plan for the research agenda, and I think that's very important to understand what's going on right now, so from a positive perspective. But from the normative side, how would we envision this collaboration? Is it enough to just have people talk to each other, mm-hmm. or should we think of perhaps a change in the mandate of some of those agencies, right? Can we expect somebody in the Public Utility Commission to consider conservation of water, or is that something outside of the mandate of the agency? So apart from having people collaborate, mm-hmm. Should collaboration also extend to some change in the mandates of state agencies?
Well, I think the way I think about that is if collaboration and coordination are important things to achieve, then of course we have to figure out what are the drivers of that. What are the conditions that make that possible? And certainly the mandates of the agencies, the authorities, and I call them authorities and responsibilities, but it's the same idea. Those are very important. But there are lots of other reasons to think that you can do great collaboration without changing the structure or the institutions themselves, right? And so I want to at least leave open the possibility that collaboration can happen even in the face of agencies that don't have that as their mission, right? So everybody I talk to in the engineering and science fields working on Nexus seem to just accept the idea that there needs to be greater collaboration. There needs to be, the people working in water have to talk to the people who are working on energy and food, with the understanding that they're probably not doing that right now. Right?
And I agree with that you know, the mandate doesn't have to be there for collaboration to materialize, but my concern is, in the absence of a mandate, even if collaboration exists, who's to say that this will be sustainable? That some change in the political leadership of the agency might sort of push that aside. So So in the process of thinking of a more sustainable
That's right.
collaboration, I wonder. if
And, you know, I've already seen a little bit of evidence, if you want to call it that, from the surveys that I described. The last question on the survey asked people to just tell us whatever they want about their connection to some other domain. And probably of the 66 questionnaires we got, probably 8 or 9 took the time to write in that they feel like they ought to be communicating, but there's something about their job that prevents them from doing it, right? So there's certainly anecdotal kinds of evidence there on that.
Okay,
He's got a key over there.
I've got a bit of a queue, yeah. So just to let you know where you are, Nick, and then I saw Annalena, and then I saw Daniel. So, Nick.
So it's interesting to think about the scope for collaboration and coordination and what's happening under the status quo. I guess I had a couple comments or questions. One is I'm wondering what mechanism exists for these different sectors to continue consider their impact on other sectors currently. So water use affects the food sector, agriculture, and it affects the energy sector. So without this sort of fully high-powered structure for coordination, what incentives do they have now to cooperate, to coordinate, to talk to each other? And then given those incentives, if you think about ramping that up and creating kind of structure that facilitates more cooperation and coordination, could that go too far? So you actually could go beyond the optimal amount of cooperation, so that you could just bog everything down, and you know the sectors just can't get done what they need to get done because they have to involve too many parties.
Right. Well, those are excellent questions. In terms of the first question, many of these agencies, particularly the water agencies, have mandates that are different from a mandate that says use the water as fast as you can, right? And yet they have the authority to promote using the water as fast as they can. It seems like that's what they're actually doing. The actual mandates of these agencies is to responsibly manage the water for the public good. And so they, at some point, they may become aware that if they continue on the path they're on, they're going to be undermining what's in the public good. I wish I could give you a more tangible answer to that question, but we're starting to see that. In San Antonio, I alluded to this in the paper, and it's a combination of the law, the state law, including the state constitution, the statewide institutions, the agencies, and all these other agencies that are involved, 58 of them by my count, that are involved in some aspect of water governance. They understand that that what they're doing right now is not sustainable. They're draining the Edwards Aquifer at an alarming rate. Of course, their approach to it is, we'll just get some more water. If we're draining the Edwards Aquifer, we'll just get some more water. So they're building desal plants, and they're now in the process of building a multi-billion-dollar pipeline to take the water from where we are at College Station and pipe it to San Antonio. So if you can get more water, of course, it solves all problems. But they're going to bump up against the economics of that. So it's expensive, and they're going to pass that cost on to ratepayers, and ratepayers aren't going to stand for it for very long. So they understand there are reasons why they need to pay attention to this changing the status quo. There are not institutions or mechanisms in place right now to address that. Right.
I guess let me follow up. If you had a system where permission was required from a bunch of entities, and there was built-in requirements, administrative procedures to get buy-in from all these different interrelated parties, would you worry that too little water would be used under that structure? Like now the problem seems to be too much because folks aren't checking in about the impact on other sectors. But if you had this structure where you had to get buy-in and permission, could you have the opposite problem?
Well, I think it's conceivable, but remember we're talking about Texas here. We're talking about a major user being the energy industry. And let's just say they're not politically uninfluential. So it's hard to imagine that they would allow, through whatever mechanisms they use, legislative, executive, they would allow too little water. At least their needs would get met. Right? Other interests may not be as able to influence those decisions. So it's always an issue for sure, and always a concern. But when you're, we're at the point where some of these deep aquifers that are being drained are never going to recharge. They say we've got plenty of water, but they're taking the water from these deep aquifers that don't recharge. It doesn't matter how much rain Houston gets, the rain doesn't get into the groundwater. Of course, their answer to that is, well, let's get these engineers at Texas A&M to figure out how to get the water into the aquifer. So they'll drill big wells to get the water in. That's the technological fix is always the first that's considered. But the fact is, we're depleting our water. We're doing what California did 30 and 40 years ago.
Let me just add on that before I get to Angelina, but because what you said is, we'll just pass this on to the ratepayers. It reminds me of what the state of Washington did in the 70s when they just said, well, the demand for power is going up like this. And they completely ignored prices. So they built these nuclear power plants and they financed them by bonds, and the state of Washington defaulted on their bonds. Because the nuclear power plants got mothballed, and it was a huge, it's a big deal when states default on their bonds and their credit rating. But they walked away from them because the hit on taxpayers or users of energy would have been so big, so they just stuck it to the guys who bought the bonds. So, Annalena.
Yeah, I think some of what you've already said gets at this, but I was wondering why you chose to focus the level of analysis at the city level. Because my understanding of a lot of a few research in this line of research is looking at larger energy production, agricultural production, water usage systems that really operate at a different scale, to regional level, and adjustments in terms of identifying efficiencies at the few nexus would require governance beyond that city level, right? So I'm interested in what you see as the benefit of starting this.
Yeah, it's a good question. What is the appropriate unit of analysis for even looking at these kinds of issues? Just to clarify, I don't use the city, at least not the city proper. I use what I refer to as the San Antonio region, and like it or not, that is not operationalized. But if I were to try to operationalize it, what I would do is I would create a map. I have some maps here, actually.
Oh, good. Now Tom's happy.
We've started to put together some GIS maps, that have the overlays to show these, but they get really complicated really fast. So I haven't figured out the best way to do it. This is where the natural gas and oil is being fracked in Texas. These are the wells that have been permitted, all right? And it goes right up to San Antonio. This is San Antonio right here. So also notice that how it stops at the border. We always draw our maps like this. Nothing's going on the other side of the border. You know? Of course, if we continued, the whole thing would just, because the Eagle Ford Shale continues into Mexico.
That's where we put the "Here there be dragons." You know? Yeah.
All right, so that's where the natural gas is, right? And again, San Antonio. This is where the water is. This is where the Edwards Aquifer and its associated water systems are. San Antonio is right here. Happens to be a lot of overlap between where the gas is and where the water is. All right, so that's why this area, this region is so important, because we're draining the water and we're extracting energy. And I didn't bring a map of it, but a lot of the agriculture in Texas is in the same area. And the governance, we have things called irrigation districts we have soil and water conservation districts. These are for farmers. These are governance organizations for farmers. And a lot of the agriculture is right in this same area. That's the food piece. It's all connected geographically, right? So that's one side of this. We're dealing with this. If I were to actually draw the geographic area of relevance to us, we would take all the areas of where the water is, where the food is grown, where the shale gas is. That's kind of the natural system side. And then we would overlay it all the governance organizations that I listed in the paper. And when we put it all together, that would be the region. I don't know, I don't have words to describe what that is right now. I'm looking for words to describe what that region would be other than the San Antonio Water, Energy, Food, Nexus region. So with that said, I didn't choose this. We are part of a big case study effort at Texas A&M, where there are now about 200 people doing research on some aspect of this water, energy, food nexus. And we've all we've all focused our attention on this San Antonio region. So engineers are working there, and everybody's doing their own work there. And we had to come to some agreement about what the geographic area we were going to work in. Everybody had their own view about it. The economists wanted to do it down here. The engineers wanted to be up there, So this is a conglomeration of all the geographies that are relevant to this area. So is this the right geographic unit? I'll let you know. I really haven't come to a conclusion about that. I know that the city proper is not the right unit, and I know the state as a whole is not the right unit. Somewhere in between, and I don't know exactly where that is. If you have some ideas about that, I'd love to hear them.
Daniel?
Hi, very interesting paper, really enjoy reading it. I have a question, maybe build on this. I think, the list for all the decision makers that you point out, by the list itself is very impressive. I'm just curious, firstly, how do you come up with the list, kind of to make sure that they are actually, right, the decision making is actually in this kind of area of Nexus, because we see for water, maybe parks, transportation, public works, and all these different agencies, and when you envision kind of the real agency, the actors, how you actually conceptualize. And then secondly, just, I don't know, kind of with your surveys, currently, who do you think is in the place actually, to coordinate, these activities, or who has the best chance, or who should be actually, coordinate all these efforts among like nearly maybe 100 or some agencies?
On the first question, we approach this from the perspective of trying to identify any organization or agency that has any kind of legal authority, legal responsibility for making decisions about water, energy, and food. or food and agriculture. This paper is based on a survey of just the water, what I call the water people, just the water agencies, okay? Now, what we did was, we simply spent 3 months trying to figure out who are the people associated with those agencies who work on water issues. So we called people, we talked to people, we looked at websites. We're fortunate at where I am that we have almost right across the street from me, the Texas Water Resources Institute. It's the big state agency that has legal responsibility for doing hydrologic and hydrogeologic work. Slightly further down the road, we have the Texas A&M Energy Institute, and not far from there, we have the School of Agriculture. And so I just talked to all these people who know Texas really well and asked them, who should we be talking to? And they gave us names. Now, the first thing we did in our survey was ask people whether they have anything to do with water in San Antonio. And one of the challenges is, that some of these institutions are organized at the county level. And these are the counties, these are the county divisions. If somebody was in a county like right here, do we include them or not? I don't know. I think they could very well be making decisions in this county, given where the water is, that affects this whole Nexus issue. But I asked the people in that county, do you have anything to do with water? And they can tell us yes or no or not. I deal with water, but not in the San Antonio area. I'll let you know what what the final result is. But just knowing that, whether they think they have anything to do with water, itself is going to be an important thing for us to sort out. So that's the answer to the first question. Well, the second question was,
who is actually in a good place to audit?
I don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, my question to you is, if you think you know the answer to that question, on what basis do you come to that conclusion? What is the theoretical? I could draw some organization charts and say, well, we have this state agency, and the leader of that agency is up here, and it's that person who should be talking to the leader of this other organization. Well, to make that assertion, you have some theoretical basis. It's an administrative one, organizational one. It's a good one, but it's not the only one. You could point to informal organization theory that says, well, no, what really goes on in organizations is people down below who may not even have jobs that are supposed to do this are the ones who are really communicating. I don't know which one's going on here, if either. Part of what we want to do is ask people in a variety of different positions whether they're interacting with people in other positions, and eventually we'll have the data to draw those network maps, those spaghetti maps, the spaghetti charts that you guys love so much, right? And we'll be able to make some inferences about that. But right now, that's an important question, but we don't have any answers to it.
I was just with Matthew Curian at a workshop last week.
Okay.
So it's nice
I met with Matthew on Saturday.
Okay, cool. So it's nice to hear, read your
You were
paper
at
after.
University of Arizona?
Yeah. And so one thing that kind of strikes me, and I don't do a lot of domestic research, so this is partly just kind of throwing something out there. The difference between food, energy, and water seems to me in part to be that energy and water in the U.S. are really tightly regulated, where the pricing of those two is very tightly controlled relative to the regulatory framework for food, where there's a lot of policy on agricultural food production, but when you think about the price of food for the consumer, there's not really
It's a market.
It's a market. It's no, I don't know if free market is the right term, but so that seems to be like a fundamental difference in the governance of the food, energy, water nexus when you think about each of those dimensions. And another difference that I think about is that a unit of water, like a cubic liter of water or a kilowatt of energy seems to be fundamentally different than a unit of food. And I don't know whether a kilogram or a calorie is the right unit of measurement.
Or a bushel or
a bushel or
who knows
yeah.
what, yeah.
But that also seems to be like food is like one of these things doesn't look like the other. And then from a geographic perspective, it seems like water and energy have a more limited transmission. So of course, water is going to move maybe a couple hundred miles or 300 miles. Energy is going to be have this kind of distance decay effect where the longer you transmit a kilowatt of energy, the less efficient it is. But then food has international boundaries, obviously. So the governance of food seems to be, like in the domestic context of the United States, seems to be fundamentally more challenging to me than the governance of water and energy. And I wonder what your reflections are on that.
I think you hit on the nose one of the real challenges with just trying to define what food and agriculture governance means in a context of a specific geographic area. We've focused more on the farming and food processing aspects of that. Farming obviously uses a lot of water for irrigation. In fact, irrigation is the #1 water user in the state of Texas, right? So it feels okay to focus on that piece of it. But the fact is that, much of our food doesn't come from Texas. It certainly doesn't come from the San Antonio area. It comes from Mexico or wherever, right? Despite the fact that when we buy food, we're buying water. There's embedded water in the food we buy, and that is being transmitted, and there's a nexus there. We still don't have ways of getting a handle on that cross-national aspect of food. Maybe never will. Maybe we don't have a good way to figure that out. But at the same time, we also know that in the United States and elsewhere, there are these buy local initiatives that are based on certain assumptions about why it's good to buy produce that's grown locally rather than grown, 5,000 miles away.
But that's kind of like if you do that math, and I'm sure like your group is talking about that, like the kind of magical ideal of everybody eating local food is basically impossible at this point. So I wonder to what extent the international food movement is part of the discussions that your group is having.
Well, it is inevitably, but it's something that's really hard to get your hands around. So if you have some ideas on how to do that, I'd love to hear that.
Thanks.
Federica?
I'm growing progressively more concerned about this question because I probably just missed something.
Probably not.
I'm gonna go ahead and ask it anyways. I am not clear on what the agencies are coordinating about. I understand that this is a complex nexus, and these are obviously important goods. But it isn't clear to me that there is an understanding of what agencies are supposed to coordinate about. Like what is in parts of your paper, you seem to suggest that it's the water conservation issue that is really driving the policy agenda. But the water conservation issue, to go back to Nick's question, is subject to incentives that differ from those that the energy or the food policy are. And so I wonder if there is some sort of like a set of hypotheses or a set of guidelines that are that you're using to sort of as a first cut to understand how best to coordinate agencies with what I expect vastly different incentive structures. Because these are the resources are used competitively. I mean, more water in order to get more energy and more food. But if we have less water, we were going to have less food and less energy.
Right. Well, that is, in my view, the central question that's still unaddressed. And I keep throwing that question back at the engineers and scientists who are telling us what the linkages are, what the nexus is. What's the plural of nexus? Is it nexi? I'm not sure. And they can't articulate it. Nexuses?
It depends if it's Latin or English.
Right.
Because it has a Latin root, then it's nexi.
Oh, I think it's
Yeah, but we have to make a decision about it.
Yeah.
I'd go with nexi.
It's combination is something.
I drive a Prius. I have 2 Priuses, and I call them Prii. So this is I think the important question. At this moment, I kind of punt on that and say, all I want to know is what is it going to take to get more collaboration, coordination, without a lot of attention to what they would be coordinating or collaborating on. My understanding at the moment, and you picked up on this in the paper, is that it's really about a mechanism, trying to design some sort of a mechanism and rationale for using less water, right? But nobody wants to say that when I ask the engineers. Well, no, it's not just about saving, it's about achieving greater efficiencies. Well, you mean economic efficiencies? What kind of efficiencies and optimum solutions are you? And they are not yet able to articulate that. So it's hard for me to, if they can't articulate it, I have trouble with it as well. And that's what the kind of thing that kind of makes my head explode. What are we talking about trying to achieve coordination for, if it isn't just water conservation? I think it is ultimately water conservation. But, so does that help?
Yeah. Thank
So I think you hit it on the nose. The engineers like to make tools, apps for their cell phones and stuff. Any engineers here?
They're all up in Purdue.
That's right, they're up in Purdue. But they make tools. Well, tools for what? Tools to assist policymakers.
To optimize.
To optimize, right? That's exactly what they said. Well, what are you optimizing? Well, we have the optimum mix of energy and water. What does that mean? And at some point they can't answer. Their heads explode, But they think it's going to change the world when they do these tools. So that's my way of deflecting attention away from our inadequacies. Yes.
Yes, following up on that discussion, have you thought of defining it or looking at it in terms of what are the outcomes that you consider favorable or not? So it seems to
Using
me,
less water.
well, but it's not just less water. It might be also the quality of the water.
Sure.
These kinds of things. I mean, it sounds like you're dealing with, essentially you've got complex systems here. You've got a governance that's got complex systems and they're interacting with each other.
That's right.
And you need to look at what is the behavior, given that these three components coexist. What are the outcomes that you're seeing, and what is good about them, and what's negative about them, and then deciding, do we want different outcomes from the system than we're getting, and identify which are the ones you want to keep and which are the ones that you don't, and you work that back from that to say, what do we need to do about governance in order to address the outcomes that we're getting. So when you frame it that way, I'm just asking, do you get more input from engineers? What's working, what's not working? What are the adverse effects from how the current system is functioning that you want to address?
Well, as I said, they're well aware of the idea that this area is using too much water. It's depleting its water resources. So they don't want to deplete the water as quickly. But they also don't want to give up on energy. They don't want to extract less oil and natural gas. So they're searching for some optimum of that sort. Beyond that, they don't have any ideas either.
Well, you were saying, for example, like with fracking, the fact that the water is not usable once it's used for that purpose. So even factoring in that it's not just sheer amount of water that's used, but how
Sure,
the quality of it's being
absolutely.
recaptured So are these agents also not looking at when you say they're focused on wanting energy, are you referring to earlier the political power that you're talking about, just the fact that in Texas the energy sector obviously is so powerful economically that politically they're not having to accept it, or is that part of the governance issue?
That is
the whole fact that they have this pre-existing set of economic power and political incentives, and that gets back to the earlier question about mandate,
right.
So that you can't, at least thus far, you haven't gotten into mechanisms in the governance structure to do that. So that would also then indicate, well, if you wanted to curb or somehow this political economic power, what would you want in a mandate to counteract that? And how might that possibly be achievable?
Well,
This is where you might actually find that under federalism, you might find that what has the power to stand up to Texas, at least in part, is the federal government. So to the extent to which there could be some mandates at a federal level that can push back against the state.
Well, you can forget about that idea.
Well, I'm not saying Trump per se, but what I'm saying is when you look at the structure, I mean,
Well, no, I mean,
but there
Texas
are,
pushes
you've
back
got FERC
against-
and you've got other things. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an energy expert, but you start looking at other mechanisms to counter that.
Clearly that, but don't expect it to come from the federal government. The federal government has, the federal agencies can only work under the authorities given to them by Congress. And Congress, as you know, has never given any federal agency a lot of authority to intervene in state decisions about water. I mean, there are some exceptions, obviously. Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, those are, but they are really pretty constrained relative to these kinds of issues. There is no federal agency, with the possible exception of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, that can do anything about any of this, all right? And even if they had the authority, of course, Texas would push back. Texas files lawsuits against the federal government all the time to prevent implementation of laws that Congress has clearly given to the federal agencies. So.
Well, what I'm saying is not necessarily directly on water, but there are other ways that within energy industry, there are other ways to have policy options that can start whittling away at the sheer power. You know, other aspects of the incentives about how the energy companies run themselves that maybe not most directly, but through other incentives, create counter pressures is all I'm saying. Yeah. So
no, I think that ultimately that is what we're trying to do. When I think about those network maps that I hope will emerge from our studies, I'm hoping that it will provide us with fairly clear idea of where the access points are, who are the central players, if you will, and are those nodes in the networks susceptible to these kinds of appeals to change the way they're doing things. That's the way this network analysis leads us to think about those kinds of issues. At the same time, there are organized interests trying to work at the legislative level or the executive branch level, but those are really difficult in a state like Texas. And I'm surprised sometimes. I had a talk with the CEO of the biggest fracking company in Texas, Pioneer Energy. And he said, look, we know we're depleting the water at a rapid rate. We don't want to do it, but we don't want to give up production. We hope that our policymakers will find a path for us, right? And what that means to him is he hopes the state will pass a law that requires, literally, he hopes the state will pass a law requiring municipal wastewater treatment facilities to take the produced water. If you haven't heard that term, that is the term that is used for the polluted water that frackers end up with. They want to have the state pass a law that requires municipal wastewater treatment facilities to take that water and clean it up and subject it to the federal standards, right? And of course, the municipalities are saying, "What? You want us to do what? With what?" You know, they won't even tell them what's in the water because it's proprietary. But they want them to take it and clean it up, right? And of course, that'll be passed on to you and me.
Is it clean upable though, from what you said?
Well,
That's the whole point. I mean, I'm trying to make sure I understand.
I think almost
On the one hand,
anything's clean
Are you saying
upable.
that are you saying they want to just shove the hot potato, or is it really that it could be? I'm just trying to make sure I
Well,
understand.
the wastewater treatment people say, we don't know how to clean it up. We don't think it can be cleaned up. And we certainly don't want to be stuck with the cost of trying to figure out how to clean it up, right?
And so and the incentive for the companies to ask the federal government to get involved is what?
They're not asking the federal government, the state government, the
Yeah, but
state
then you said
legis-
something right after that.
I didn't
That you
mean,
want to meet federal standards or
oh,
something.
the federal standards, Clean Water Act standards.
Yeah, but those are changeable. See, this is where you can get the federal government involved, because if it has to meet a federal standard, now you've got lobbying that can take place at the federal level. See, it almost sounds like, from what you described, it almost sounds like these companies are saying, look, I can't stop producing, because that's what I'm in the business for doing. Yet I know that we're destroying this water. It's almost like they're saying, but we need somebody else to be able to push
Of
back
course.
and tell us we can't do it, because we can't self-restrain ourselves.
Well, it's not just that.
Partly because of the stock market price and all this other kind of stuff, the kind of beings that they are, and understanding how corporations work. It's almost like they're saying, we need somebody to be able to push back, tell us that we can't do it, and that will be the reason why we can't do it, but we can't not do it.
Right.
We can't self-initiate doing it. But if that's really the case, if that really is the case, then having worked in a lot of policy circles myself that I've been involved in, if that's really the thing, there's lots of deals that can be struck. Okay? It's all how you sell it to the public. But basically, if they have an incentive and they actually want government to push back some way, there are some ways that I'm just wondering, have you been looking at that? What kinds of deals could be struck where essentially the companies are saying, look, if you only do this, you only do that, then we have a reason to tell our shareholders, investors, everything else why we have to do it this way. It sounds to me there might be some room for some negotiation.
Well, those kinds of discussions happen all the time, but the energy company's position has been, as long as you pay for the cleanup, we're all in favor of it. As long as you take our our produced water and clean it up, we're all in favor.
What if the government came back and said, yeah, we'll impose a tax on you because of the cost of the
Of course,
cleanup?
they won't accept that.
No, you should, I should.
If you're right in on
So this is a all short-term versus long-term problem?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Well, there are certainly aspects.
Well, I'm saying is there is not yet a way you can find it, help to internalize the cost to these companies and what they're doing.
Oh, for sure. And our state policymakers have no inclination to tackle that at all. You know, it's one of the issues that I talk to about the engineers. The engineers again say, if we just develop the information about the trade-offs, then our policymakers will make different decisions. And I keep telling them, I don't think so. I think they have a pretty good idea. They may not know the details, but our state legislature, being what it is, knows what trade-offs are being made, and they seem to be okay with it. If you give them more information about it, they're still going to be okay with it. You know, and they don't believe that, but that's my cynical view about policymaking in Texas.
Yeah, I am really confused about what this paper is about. Is it about Edwards Aquifer? Is it about ways to think about organization of bureaucracy? I can't tell that. I mean, there is something called the Edwards Aquifer Authority, which I'm looking at the website here, that's supposed to have governance authority over the whole thing. That's not really, it's in your data, but it's not really mentioned here. So I'm not sure what you're trying to do. Are you trying to do a study of the Edwards Aquifer? Are you trying to get us to rethink the way bureaucracy should be organized?
Well, it's more the latter, but it's not just about bureaucracy. It's about governance. Who's governing these resources?
So what are the questions? Give me a preliminary hypothesis or something. I don't know what the question is really. Trying to answer here.
Well, there are many. I tried to outline some of them in the paper. They're very preliminary in the sense that before you can have a hypothesis, you need to have some theory. And I don't know what the theory underlying all this is. Is it a theory of bureaucracy? Is it a theory of administrative management? Is it a social capital theory? There are so many possibilities. And I suppose you could have different hypotheses generated from each one of those kinds of theories. Of course, I'm just talking about a few of them. But ultimately, we're trying to understand how to promote coordinated governance, nexus governance over these resources.
What about the Edwards Aquifer Authority? What is that a governing? I mean,
It is a governing
What
authority.
does it do? It has authority over this region on which the aquifer lies. It seemed like that would be the place to start to see to what extent that
Every one of the organizations on that list has legal authority to make decisions about the water. Every one of them. The Edwards Aquifer Authority is one of them. If you read the legal grounds, if you will, under which these organizations are created, it's pretty ambiguous. They all have explicit authority. The big actors in all this are what's called the groundwater conservation districts. They have legal authority to make decisions about who gets to drill a well, where, and how much water they're allowed to pump. They have the legal authority. It's a crazy system, if you will, system of governance. These groundwater conservation districts are 501c3 organizations. They're nonprofit organizations. They have their own governance structures, as any legal 501c3 organization would have, and the legislature gives them the authority for making decisions about this public resource, right? So all this is to say we don't know what they're doing. We don't know what they're actually doing. You could look at the legislation under which they're created and say they ought to be doing X, Y, or Z. Well, we don't know what they're actually doing. Nobody has actually studied these organizations. That's why we're doing this pilot work, if you will. So I didn't give you a very satisfying answer to this, but we do have some hypotheses. At least the hypotheses that I extracted come out of social network theory, not out of much of any other theory.
Now, let me take this in a slightly different direction, and Tom's question sort of brought it up, but I want to flip it on its head, that in markets and in agriculture, for the most part, they see prices. They see prices of inputs, they see prices of outputs, and it seems here that they're not seeing real prices, and they're certainly not for energy and their use of water, and they're certainly not seeing upon downstream prices of when they ramp up with these things. Yeah. So from an economist point of view, if economists are on board with this, and the engineers, you want to mimic the market to internalize these so-called externalities, where if the frackers are pushing on the municipal people and they push it on the municipal water users, as you said, that's going to bump up to something, but you want to prevent that from being catastrophic, because then it's going to be the Washington State bond issue over again, that people are running away from it. So it seems as if this is a crisis waiting to happen, and I don't blame the frackers. I mean, they need to be regulated in a way where they see real prices for the resources that they're using. So in your discussions with economists and engineers in their models, the first things economists like to do is say you need to mimic the market. But as a political economist, I say, but then there's the political market that has currency. So you need to mimic that market where these guys have short-term time horizons because they want to get elected and stay in office and so on, and they'll pass that on to the next guy, or they'll deal with it when it becomes a crisis. But have the people you've been talking about used that kind of language of
Sure.
establishing prices?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that most people working on this area agree on is the price of water is too low.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
just, it's already kept artificially low.
Right.
And so the struggle, part of the struggle is to find the optimum price, right?
Yeah.
And short of, I'm sure you have these discussions all the time about how do you privatize a common pool resource, you know?
Well, there's a difference between optimum and better.
True. True.
So that to the extent that and you can block price, so that, give all municipal owners, municipal users free water. It doesn't matter, they use so little for drinking water and so on. I mean, yeah, you want to cap it, right? You don't want to just water their lawns, but so we can block price.
Sure. And they do that in San Antonio.
They do.
Yeah.
And so
It's still too low.
it's still way too low. So these frackers, their demand at whatever price it's set is perfectly inelastic.
Right.
In other words, it doesn't matter what the price is right now.
Yeah, and of course,
But at some point it would matter to them, right? So the question is, if you double it, if you treble it, if you tenfold it, where does, when the economists do the math, at what point do these guys start using less? Or rely on technological change that husbands the water or reuses the water, and they collaborate
Yeah, I mean-
with people who can clean it up.
you can do the calculation, do the estimates of the price elasticity demand and what price.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah.
But the price would be so high that they wouldn't accept it. They would fight it. And
Yeah,
that's
so
what's
that's the
essentially
political
going on. That's the
part.
political side of it.
That's
right?
the political side of it, yeah.
So
But there must be some middle ground where you could get to better as opposed to best, is what I'm saying. Better gets you moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
That causes them to start looking for conservation.
Yeah.
And maybe not do that extra bit of fracking.
Yeah.
So I think you don't want the optimal optimorum to get away in the way of the better policies.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of times people search for this optimum when in fact we know the direction, and it seems like what you're saying, it isn't that food's too expensive, really, it's that water's too expensive, and that certain sectors are using it, and
right.
you could have a tax.
Yeah, that's right. If we had, we deal with government. This is our stuff, right? We ought to be able to say this is the way to do it,
Yeah,
but we
right.
don't know how to do it.
No,
I'm
this
sorry,
is
we
a tough
don't know how to
one.
do it.
This is a hard problem.
I was actually looking at the networks that you.
Those are hypothetical
Oh,
networks.
those are.
Yeah. We don't have any data yet.
Okay. Because the way that you design the networks, they all have gatekeepers,
Right.
and so that would be.
Those are the access points, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah, that would, the purpose of that was to, demonstrate that exact point, that maybe we'll find this,
Right.
and if we find this, these are the implications
Okay.
from that.
Thank you.
Our hope is that when we get enough data, we'll be able to actually draw the actual maps and make inferences that will be helpful to us. But we don't have that yet.
You could give a pointer.
I don't want to take more time, but just quickly to say, go back to what Barbara was saying about the incentive that frackers might have
Yeah.
to ask for regulation. One plausible explanation would be that they want to create a barrier to entry, right?
Right,
So they would
exactly.
want to create an obstacle for new entrants to come in, assuming that
No, would they really do that?
assuming that they believe they can sort of respond to that, right? They believe that
Yeah.
if pushed, they would have the technology to use even less water or to be more efficient in their use of water.
Yeah.
So the question is, what does that marginal abatement cost curve look like, right?
Mhm.
What would it
Yeah.
take from them in terms of investment
Yeah.
to move to
Great
be more
question.
efficient?
Yeah.
So,
Well, but the problem there is the state boundaries, because they're not just fracking in Texas.
correct. That's a good point. Yeah.
So
yeah.
the problem is,
Or they're bringing water from outside of Texas.
yeah. But either way, it's gas market's national, or international. So that's a problem with these, boundaries. I mean, they'd be happy to all cut back, I'm sure, if they could make
That's right.
sure that everybody else is cutting. Not sure, but if everybody else is cutting back, depends on the slope of the demand curve for natural gas and so on and so forth. Well,
But that's where the federal government could help to the
Oh,
extent
yeah,
to which you
yeah,
want a
exactly.
national standard,
They
so
could.
that it
They
isn't
could,
one
but
state
they-
competing
but
against the
it's-
other, and
that's right.
everybody's in the
Yeah.
same boat.
yeah, I mean, in principle,
Yeah.
they could.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, this strikes me as one of those, problems from hell. That's really, really hard, but really, really important.
I have the same challenge that all of you have, which is at some point your head wants to explode. And I just thought I'd share that with you. Share the pain.
So, no, take a few minutes to sum up if you like, or.
Well, I think that for those of you who might be looking for research areas, there's something to this. I have as much trouble articulating what exactly it is as you might, but there really is something to this, and I certainly want to be part of defining what that research agenda would look like. If it's something that any of you would think you might want to work on, or some aspect of it, please let me know, and I'll be happy to engage in that discussion with you. I think that's probably all I'll say. I know it's time for most of you to leave, but think about this. I tell this to the engineers all the time. I've never been involved in a research area where the goal is to put itself out of business. Think about water, energy, food nexus. The purpose of their research is to break the linkage, break the nexus, to make the nexus go away, to have energy with no water, to grow food with no water, to have no connection whatsoever. I've never seen a research area where the goal is to make the research area go away. Yeah, that's what's going on here. So think about that. If your head wasn't ready to explode before.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.